The year was 2387, and Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance watching stars drift past the main screen. He had been in space for 12 years, but the sight still amazed him. His ship was different from everything else in the Galactic Federation fleet. While other vessels used alien technology that had been proven for thousands of years, the Defiance carried something new, something human. The bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of engines and the gentle beeping of control panels. Lieutenant Ben Hughes sat at the tactical station running weapon checks for the third time that day. Chief Katie Walsh was in engineering, making sure their experimental systems worked properly. Corporal Danny Price monitored communications from his station near the back wall. Jake had been commanding the Defiance for 2 years now. The ship was humanity's newest warship and their most advanced. Unlike the massive alien dreadnoughts that relied on raw power, the Defiance was built around human ideas. The weapons could change their configuration in seconds. The computer systems learned and adapted like a human mind. Most importantly, the ship could think in ways that aliens found impossible to understand. Humanity had joined the Galactic Federation 30 years ago. They were still considered newcomers by the 3 great powers that ruled space. The Zephyrians were tall crystal beings who controlled energy itself. Their ships could fire beams that melted planets. The Krillax Empire was made up of insect creatures that thought as one mind. They could coordinate millions of ships perfectly. The Voidborn were mysterious beings who could bend space and time. Their vessels appeared and disappeared like ghosts. These 3 races had kept peace in the galaxy for over 10,000 years. They saw humans as children playing with toys. Human technology was primitive compared to theirs. Human ships were small and weak. Human tactics were chaotic and made no sense. At least that was what they believed. The communication panel suddenly lit up with an emergency signal. Danny straightened in his chair and turned to face Jake. His young face was serious as he spoke. The signal was coming from the Galactic Council on the capital world of Nexus Prime. All fleet commanders were ordered to report immediately for an emergency meeting. Jake felt his stomach tighten. Emergency meetings were rare. The last one had been 15 years ago, when a star went supernova and threatened 3 systems. He ordered the ship to change course for Nexus Prime. The journey would take 6 hours at maximum speed. During the trip, reports started coming in from the Outer Rim territories. 2 colony worlds had gone silent. Scout ships sent to investigate never returned. Long-range sensors detected something massive moving through space toward the inner systems. Something that shouldn't exist. When the Defiance arrived at Nexus Prime, Jake saw the largest gathering of alien warships in Federation history. Thousands of vessels filled the space around the planet. Zephyrian crystal ships that looked like floating cathedrals. Krillax swarm carriers that resembled giant metal insects. Voidborn ships that seemed to phase in and out of reality. Among them were a few dozen human vessels, small and plain compared to the alien giants. The council meeting was held in the great assembly hall that could hold representatives from 100 different species. Jake took his place in the human section, feeling tiny among the towering aliens around him. The 3 great powers sat at the front of the hall on raised platforms that showed their importance. Supreme Navigator Thais of the Zephyrians spoke first. Her crystal body glowed with inner light as she shared the terrible news. An enemy had appeared from beyond the galaxy. They called themselves the Devourers, and they consumed everything in their path. Ships, planets, entire star systems disappeared when they passed through. The 2 lost colonies had been completely absorbed, leaving nothing behind but empty space. Hive Queen Zexathera of the Krillax showed tactical displays of the enemy fleet. The Devourers had hundreds of massive ships unlike anything seen before. They seemed to be made from pieces of other vessels welded together. Weapons from a dozen different races were mounted on their hulls. Most disturbing of all, the ships appeared to be learning and adapting after each battle. Elder Nyx of the Voidborn revealed the worst news. The Devourers had come from the Andromeda Galaxy, where they had consumed 3 entire civilizations. Each time they defeated an enemy, they took their technology and made it better. They were not just conquerors. They were a force that grew stronger with every victory. The great powers quickly formed their battle plan. The Zephyrian fleet would use their energy weapons to break through enemy shields. The Krillax swarms would overwhelm the Devourers with numbers and coordinated attacks. The Voidborn would use their space manipulation to strike from impossible angles. Together, they would stop this threat before it reached the core worlds. Admiral Lisa Carter spoke for humanity when the aliens finished their planning. She offered human ships and crews to help in the coming battle. The response was immediate and dismissive. Supreme Navigator Thys explained that human technology was too primitive to be useful. Hive Queen Zexthara stated that human ships would only get in the way of proper military formations. Elder Nyx simply said that humans lacked the experience to fight such an advanced enemy. Jake felt anger rising in his chest but kept his face calm. He had expected this response. The aliens always underestimated humanity. They saw human chaos as weakness instead of strength. They missed the creativity that made human minds special. Admiral Carter accepted the decision with dignity. She announced that human forces would take defensive positions around the core worlds. The Defiance and a few other ships would observe the battle from a safe distance. They would provide rescue operations if needed and gather intelligence on enemy tactics. As the meeting ended, and the great alien fleets prepared to depart, Jake made his way back to his ship. His crew was waiting on the bridge, having monitored the entire conference through the communication systems. Ben looked frustrated at being left out of the fight. Katie was already working on modifications to make their systems more effective. Danny was tracking the movement of alien fleets as they formed up for battle. Jake settled into his command chair and looked at his crew. These were good people who had volunteered to serve on an experimental ship. They believed in human potential even when the rest of the galaxy saw them as inferior. The aliens were about to face an enemy that adapted to everything they did. But the Devourers had never faced humans before. They had never encountered the beautiful chaos of human thinking. The Defiance moved into position at the edge of the Kepler Nebula, where the battle would take place. Jake watched the alien fleets arrange themselves in perfect formations. Everything was planned and organized according to thousands of years of military tradition. It was impressive and terrifying and completely predictable. Something told him that predictability was exactly what the Devourers were counting on. The battle began at dawn on the planet below the Kepler Nebula. Jake Morrison watched from the bridge of the Defiance as the greatest military force in galactic history moved into position. 3,000 alien warships formed a wall of metal and energy that stretched across space. The sight was magnificent and terrible at the same time. The Zephyrian crystal ships took the center position. Their hulls glowed with stored energy that could melt asteroids. Supreme Navigator Thys commanded from her flagship, a massive cathedral of living crystal that pulsed with inner light. The ship was beautiful and deadly, capable of firing energy beams that could punch through any known armor. On the left flank, the Krillax swarm carriers released their fighters. Millions of small ships poured out like angry insects moving in perfect coordination. Each pilot was connected to the hive mind, thinking as one massive intelligence. Hive Queen Zexthara controlled them all from her enormous carrier, a ship that looked like a metal mountain covered in weapons. The right flank belonged to the Voidborn. Their ships seemed to fade in and out of reality as they moved through folded space. Elder Nyx led them from a vessel that existed in multiple dimensions at once. The Voidborn could appear anywhere on the battlefield without warning, striking enemies who never saw them coming. Jake had never seen such organized power. Every ship knew its place and purpose. The formations were perfect, tested by 10,000 years of successful warfare. Any enemy facing this force should have surrendered immediately. But the Devourers were not any enemy. The enemy fleet emerged from behind a gas giant like a nightmare made real. Their ships were wrong in ways that hurt to look at. Each vessel seemed to be made from pieces of other ships welded together without any plan. Zephyrian crystal sections were fused with Krillax metal plating. Voidborn energy conduits ran through hulls that belonged to extinct races. The ships looked broken but somehow worked anyway. Lieutenant Ben Hughes counted the enemy vessels from his tactical station. 400 Devourer ships faced 3,000 Federation vessels. The numbers should have made this a quick victory. But Ben noticed something disturbing in the enemy formation. The Devourer ships were not random collections of salvage. Each one had been built for a specific purpose using the best parts from conquered civilizations. The first attack came from the Zephyrians. Supreme Navigator Thys gave the order, and her fleet fired as one. Thousands of energy beams lanced across space, each one hot enough to boil oceans. The beams struck the Devourer fleet and tore through their hulls like paper. Explosions bloomed across the enemy formation as ships died in brilliant flashes of light. But the Devourers did not break or retreat. The surviving ships continued forward, their hulls already changing. Jake watched in horror as the enemy vessels began to adapt. Crystal formations grew on their surfaces, identical to Zephyrian technology. When the second wave of energy beams hit, they struck the new crystal sections and reflected back toward the Federation fleet. Zephyrian ships died as their own weapons turned against them. The crystal beings had never faced an enemy that could copy their technology in real time. Supreme Navigator Thys ordered her ships to change frequency and power settings, but the Devourers adapted just as quickly. Each modification was matched within minutes. Hive Queen Zexathera saw the Zephyrians faltering and launched her swarm attack. Millions of fighter craft swept toward the enemy in perfect coordination. The pilots shared one mind and moved like a single organism. No enemy had ever broken a Krillax swarm because breaking one part meant fighting them all. The Devourers met the swarm with fighters of their own. These ships were smaller copies of the main fleet, built from pieces of every race they had encountered. But something else happened as the two forces clashed. The Devourer ships began broadcasting signals on the same frequencies the Krillax used for hive communication. Jake watched the impossible happen. The Krillax swarm began to break apart as pilots lost contact with the hive mind. The Devourers were jamming their communications using their own technology. Individual Krillax fighters found themselves alone and confused, unable to coordinate with their squad mates. The perfect swarm became scattered prey for Devourer hunters. Hive Queen Zexthera tried to adapt by changing communication frequencies, but the enemy was already copying those too. Worse, some Krillax pilots began receiving false orders that sent them crashing into their own ships or flying straight into enemy fire. The hive mind that had been their greatest strength became a weakness the Devourers could exploit. Elder Nyx and the Voidborn made their move as the other two fleets struggled. Their ships phased out of normal space and appeared behind the Devourer formation. This was the Voidborn's most powerful ability. They could attack from any angle without warning, appearing inside enemy shields or materializing next to command ships. The Voidborn assault should have ended the battle. Their weapons fired from point-blank range into unprotected Devourer hulls. Several enemy ships exploded immediately, but as Elder Nyx watched, the surviving Devourers began to change again. Strange devices appeared on their hulls, copied from destroyed Voidborn vessels found in other systems. The devices activated and something impossible happened. The Devourers anchored themselves to normal space-time. When the Voidborn tried to phase shift again, they found themselves trapped in regular space. Their greatest advantage was gone. Worse, the Devourers could now track Voidborn movements and predict where they would appear. The battle turned into a slaughter. Each alien tactic was copied and countered within minutes. The Devourers were not just winning, they were learning. Every destroyed Federation ship was scanned and its technology absorbed. Every successful enemy attack was analyzed and defended against. The adaptive capability of the Devourers was beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. Chief Katie Walsh monitored the battle from the Defiance's engineering station. She watched the sensor readings with growing understanding. The enemy ships were not just copying alien technology, they were improving it. Zephyrian energy weapons fired faster and hotter when mounted on Devourer hulls. Krillax coordination systems worked better when combined with other technologies. The Devourers were taking the best parts of every civilization and making them work together. Supreme Navigator, Thys was the first to order retreat. Her crystal fleet had lost 70% of its ships and the survivors were damaged beyond repair. The Zephyrian formations broke apart as captains tried to save what they could of their crews. Some ships made it to safety, but many were caught by pursuing Devourers and consumed. Hive Queen Zexathera held out longer, but her situation was hopeless. The hive mind was compromised and her pilots were scattered across the battlefield. She finally ordered a fighting withdrawal, sacrificing her remaining fighters to buy time for the carriers to escape. Only a few dozen Krillax ships survived out of thousands. Elder Nyx and the Voidborn suffered the worst losses. Trapped in normal space, their advanced ships were no match for adapted Devourer weapons. The mysterious beings who had once seemed invincible were reduced to a handful of vessels fleeing through conventional space. Drive. The three great powers that had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years were broken in a single day. Their combined fleets were scattered, and their military might was shattered. Worse, the Devourers had absorbed their technology and grown stronger. What had been 400 enemy ships was now over 600 as the Devourers rebuilt and expanded using captured resources. Jake Morrison sat in his command chair and watched the greatest military disaster in galactic history unfold before him. The Federation's finest had been crushed by an enemy that turned their own strengths against them. But as he studied the battle data, Jake began to see something that the alien commanders had missed. The Devourers were perfect at copying and improving existing technology, but they had never created anything truly new. They were masters of adaptation but slaves to the examples they found. They could copy any tactic they saw, but they could not imagine tactics that did not yet exist. Danny Price was receiving distress calls from across the battlefield. Alien ships that had escaped the main battle were requesting rescue. Some had engine damage and could not reach safety. Others had lost life support and were dying slowly in the void. The Galactic Council had ordered all human ships to maintain their positions and avoid engagement. Jake looked at his crew and saw the same thought in their eyes. Orders were orders, but people were dying. Human ships might not be strong enough to fight the Devourers, but they were fast enough to rescue survivors. The enemy was busy consuming the battlefield and had not paid attention to the small human vessels, watching from the edge of the nebula. He gave the order to move in and begin rescue operations. The Defiance might not be able to save the galaxy, but it could save lives. And while they saved those lives, they would learn everything they could about an enemy that had never faced anything like human unpredictability. The rescue operations lasted 3 days, and Jake Morrison's crew saved over 2,000 lives. The Defiance moved through the debris field like a ghost, picking up survivors from destroyed alien warships. Each rescue mission taught them more about their enemy. The Devourers had consumed everything useful and left only empty hulks behind. Chief Katie Walsh studied the wreckage of a Zephyrian cruiser while her engineering teams helped evacuate the survivors. The crystal ship had been beautiful once, but now it was just broken fragments. The interesting part was how the Devourers had stripped it. They had taken every piece of technology but left the decorative elements behind. Art and culture meant nothing to them. Only function mattered. Lieutenant Ben Hughes interviewed the rescued alien officers and learned disturbing facts about Devourer tactics. The enemy had not just copied their weapons and defenses. They had somehow downloaded tactical databases from captured ships. The Devourers now knew every battle plan and strategy the three great powers had developed over thousands of years. But the most important discovery came from Corporal Danny Price. While monitoring enemy communications during the battle, he had noticed something strange. The Devourers used the same command frequencies as their victims. When they captured Krillax ships, they started using Krillax signals. When they absorbed Zephyrian technology, they adopted Zephyrian communication protocols. They were perfect mimics, but they had no original language of their own. News of the defeat spread across the galaxy like wildfire. Panic gripped the core worlds as refugees fled toward the inner systems. The three great powers tried to rally their remaining forces, but the damage was too severe. Supreme Navigator Thys had lost her entire fleet command structure. Hive Queen Zexathara was struggling to rebuild the hive mind with so few survivors. Elder Nyx had retreated to the Voidborn home dimension and would not respond to communication attempts. Admiral Lisa Carter received new orders from Earth Command. Human forces were to prepare defensive positions around the core worlds and attempt to organize the remaining alien survivors. For the first time in galactic history, humanity was being asked to take a leadership role. The irony was not lost on anyone. The species the aliens had dismissed as primitive were now their only hope. Jake brought the Defiance to the rally point at Sigma Station, a massive space dock in the heart of Federation space. What he found there broke his heart. Proud alien warriors sat in refugee camps, their spirits crushed by defeat. Ships that had once been the pride of their fleets were now patched together with emergency repairs. The greatest military force in galactic history had been reduced to a few hundred vessels and broken morale. Admiral Carter arrived on the station 3 hours later. She was a small woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. Jake had served under her command for 5 years and knew she was one of the finest strategic minds humanity had produced. If anyone could organize this mess into a fighting force, it would be her. The strategy meeting took place in the station's main conference room. The surviving alien commanders attended by hologram, since many were too injured to travel. Admiral Carter listened to their reports without interruption. Each speaker told the same story. The Devourers were advancing toward the core worlds with a fleet that had grown to over 800 ships. They would reach the inner systems within 2 weeks. When the aliens finished speaking, Admiral Carter stood and walked to the tactical display. She pointed to the projected course of the Devourer fleet and asked a simple question. Had anyone tried fighting them in a way they had never seen before? The aliens looked confused. There were only so many ways to conduct space warfare. Energy weapons, kinetic projectiles, fighter swarms, and space manipulation covered all the tactical possibilities. Katie Walsh raised her hand from her position at the back of the room. She had been studying the battle recordings and noticed something important. The Devourers were incredibly efficient at adapting to known tactics, but they always took the same approach. They copied exactly what they saw without making any creative changes. They were like advanced computers following programming instead of intelligent beings making choices. Ben Hughes added his own observation. During the rescue operations, he had watched Devourer ships respond to threats. When human vessels appeared, the enemy had tried to use the same scanning and communication patterns they used against alien ships. But human technology was different enough that their standard approaches had not worked properly. The Devourers had seemed confused by human unpredictability. Admiral Carter smiled for the first time since arriving at the station. She turned to address the alien commanders and made an announcement that shocked everyone in the room. Humanity would take point in the next engagement against the Devourers. Human ships would lead the attack using tactics that no alien mind would consider logical or effective. The response was immediate and negative. The aliens argued that human ships were too small and weak to face the Devourer fleet. Human weapons were primitive compared to what the enemy had already absorbed. Human tactics were chaotic and would only result in another massacre. Admiral Carter listened to their objections and then made her position clear. The alien way of warfare had failed completely. Perfect formations and time-tested strategies had been turned against them by an enemy that could adapt to anything they had seen before. But the Devourers had never encountered human creativity. They had never faced opponents who changed their minds on purpose and made decisions that defied logic. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as Admiral Carter explained her plan. The Defiance would be the lead ship in a new kind of battle. Instead of fighting like civilized beings with rules and formations, they would fight like humans. They would be unpredictable, chaotic, and completely insane by alien standards. The goal was not to defeat the Devourer fleet, but to confuse them long enough for other human ships to exploit their weaknesses. The alien commanders reluctantly agreed to the plan after Admiral Carter pointed out that they had no other options. The Devourer fleet was too strong for conventional tactics and too adaptive for anything they had tried before. Human unpredictability was the only weapon left that the enemy had not encountered. Preparations began immediately. Katie Walsh started modifying the Defiance's systems in ways that violated every safety protocol in the Federation manual. She rerouted power through backup systems to create energy signatures that would confuse enemy sensors. She programmed the weapons to fire in patterns based on human music instead of mathematical calculations. She even installed mining charges that could be used as improvised weapons. Ben Hughes worked with the tactical database to develop attack patterns that made no strategic sense. He studied ancient human warfare from the pre-space era and found inspiration in guerrilla tactics that focused on mobility and surprise instead of direct confrontation. He created maneuver plans that would make alien commanders think the human crew had lost their minds. Danny Price prepared communication systems that would broadcast human cultural data instead of standard military signals. He loaded the computers with everything from classical music to children's stories. The idea was to flood enemy sensors with information that would be impossible to analyze or understand. How could the Devourers adapt to a nursery rhyme or a jazz improvisation? As the Defiance prepared for what might be humanity's first and last major space battle, Jake felt both fear and excitement. They were about to face an enemy that had crushed civilizations far more advanced than their own. But they had something those civilizations lacked. They had the human ability to be completely and wonderfully unpredictable. The Devourer fleet was still 6 days away from the core worlds. In that time, Jake and his crew would either prove that human chaos could triumph over alien order, or they would die in the attempt. Either way, the galaxy would never be the same. The Devourer fleet arrived exactly when predicted. emerging from hyperspace like a swarm of mechanical demons. Jake Morrison watched from the bridge of the Defiance as 800 enemy ships filled the star system. Each vessel was larger than before, grown fat on absorbed alien technology. The lead ship was massive beyond belief, a twisted cathedral of stolen parts that dwarfed even the largest alien dreadnoughts. Behind Jake's ship, 200 vessels waited in loose formation. Most were human ships that had responded to Admiral Carter's call for volunteers. The rest were alien survivors who had chosen to follow humanity into what seemed like certain death. It was the strangest fleet in galactic history, held together by desperation and hope rather than military doctrine. The enemy formation was perfect as always. The Devourers moved in precise lines, their weapons already charging for the battle ahead. They had fought this way against every opponent and won every time. But they had never faced Captain Jake Morrison and the crew of the Defiance. Admiral Carter's voice came through the communication system from her command ship. Her orders were simple and terrifying. The Defiance was to engage the enemy advance guard alone, while the rest of the fleet waited for the signal. Jake was to fight in the most unpredictable way possible, and broadcast everything on open channels so the Devourers could study human tactics. The goal was to confuse them and buy time for the real attack. Jake looked at his crew and saw fear mixed with determination on their faces. Chief Katie Walsh had finished her modifications and the ship was ready for battle. Lieutenant Ben Hughes had programmed their weapons with attack patterns that would make no sense to any logical mind. Corporal Danny Price had loaded the communication systems with enough human culture to confuse an entire civilization. The Defiance moved forward alone toward the massive enemy fleet. Jake felt his heart pounding as they approached the advance guard of 50 Devourer ships. Each enemy vessel was 3 times the size of his ship and armed with weapons copied from a dozen different races. By every rule of warfare, this was suicide. The first surprise came when Ben Hughes opened fire. Instead of targeting the enemy ships directly, he aimed at the asteroids floating near the Devourer formation. The mining charges Katie had installed exploded among the rocks, creating clouds of metal fragments that confused enemy sensors. The Devourers tried to scan through the debris, but their adapted alien sensors could not penetrate the chaos. Jake ordered the ship to dive into the asteroid field, using the floating rocks as cover. This was not how space battles were supposed to work. Ships fought in open space with clear lines of sight and predictable maneuvers, but the Defiance weaved between asteroids like a fighter plane. Too small and fast for the enemy's massive weapons to track effectively. The Devourers adapted quickly, switching to smaller weapons and faster targeting systems, but Katie had prepared for this. She activated her power routing modifications, and the Defiance's energy signature changed completely. One moment they appeared to be a small human frigate, the next they looked like a Zephyrian escort, then like a piece of space debris. The enemy sensors could not maintain a lock on a target that kept changing its identity. Danny Price began broadcasting human music on all frequencies. The song was an old Earth tune called The Star-Spangled Banner, but he played it backward and mixed it with jazz improvisation. The Devourers tried to decode the transmission as tactical data, wasting processing power on analyzing the emotional content of patriotic music played in reverse. The enemy ships grew frustrated and began firing wildly into the asteroid field. Their weapons, copied from precise alien technologies, were not designed for this kind of chaotic combat. Jake watched enemy beams miss his ship by meters as the Devourers struggled to hit a target that refused to behave logically. Ben Hughes implemented the next phase of their insane battle plan. He launched every missile the ship carried, but programmed them to fly in spirals instead of straight lines. The missiles danced through space like drunken birds, following flight paths based on mathematical equations derived from human poetry. The Devourers tried to intercept them but could not predict where randomly flying projectiles would go next. 3 enemy ships died in the first missile attack, not because the weapons were particularly powerful, but because the Devourers had positioned themselves to defend against logical attack patterns. When missiles approached from impossible angles and changed direction for no apparent reason, their defensive systems failed completely. Katie Walsh pushed the Defiance's engines beyond safe limits, using emergency power to make the ship accelerate in ways that should have torn it apart. She had reinforced the hull with human engineering principles that focused on flexibility instead of rigid strength. The ship bent and twisted under impossible forces but held together through creative problem-solving rather than superior materials. The battle became a deadly game of tag as the Defiance darted between enemy ships like an annoying insect. Jake ordered ramming attacks that stopped just short of impact, confusing Devourer crews who expected either collision or retreat. He had weapons fire at empty space for no reason, making the enemy think they were missing hidden targets. Every action was designed to be unpredictable and illogical. The Devourers finally began to adapt to human tactics, but it was too late. The real attack had already begun. While the enemy focused on the crazy human ship dancing through their formation, 200 Allied vessels approached from multiple directions. Each ship followed the Defiance's example, fighting in ways that made no strategic sense. Human ships used musical timing for their weapon firing sequences. They coordinated attacks based on sports plays from ancient Earth games. They even used children's games like tag and hide-and-seek as tactical models. The Devourers, trained to counter logical military doctrine, found themselves facing opponents who had thrown logic out the nearest airlock. The enemy fleet began to suffer serious losses as their adaptive systems overloaded. Every time they thought they understood human tactics, the humans did something completely different. Ships that had easily crushed alien formations found themselves destroyed by opponents who treated warfare like a creative art project rather than a military science. Jake watched enemy vessels explode around him as the Allied fleet carved through Devourer formations. But the celebration was premature. The massive command ship at the center of the enemy fleet began to glow with power. Something was happening that would change the entire battle. The Prime Devourer had been watching and learning. Unlike its smaller vessels, this intelligence was capable of true adaptation. It had analyzed human unpredictability and found patterns in the chaos. Worse, it was beginning to fight back using human tactics combined with superior alien technology. The bridge of the Defiance shook as enemy fire finally found its mark. Katie's modifications had kept them alive this long, but the ship was taking damage faster than it could be repaired. The hull was breached in 7 places and life support was failing. Jake faced a choice that would determine the fate of the galaxy. He could retreat and preserve his ship for future battles. The Defiance had already proven that humans could fight the Devourers effectively. Other ships could continue the fight using the lessons learned here. It was the logical choice, and it was what any reasonable commander would do. But Jake Morrison had never been accused of being reasonable. He looked at his crew and saw the same crazy determination in their eyes. They had come this far by ignoring logic and embracing the beautiful chaos of human creativity. Why stop now? The Prime Devourer wanted to see human unpredictability. Jake was about to give it more chaos than it could handle. The Prime Devourer turned its attention toward the Defiance like a giant, focusing on an annoying fly. Jake Morrison felt the enemy's sensors sweep over his ship with crushing intensity. This was not like the other Devourer vessels they had fought. This intelligence was ancient and vast, capable of processing information from 1,000 battles at once. The massive enemy ship began to move with purpose that chilled Jake's blood. It was learning human tactics in real time and adapting them to its own use. Weapons that had been firing in perfect alien formations suddenly switched to chaotic human patterns. The Prime Devourer was fighting unpredictably, while still maintaining the overwhelming firepower of absorbed civilizations. Lieutenant Ben Hughes watched his tactical display with growing horror. The enemy command ship was using human creativity but combining it with alien efficiency. It fired missiles in random spirals like the Defiance had done, but each missile was guided by Zephyrian energy control and protected by Krillak's adaptive armor. The Prime Devourer was taking the best parts of human chaos and making them deadlier. Chief Katie Walsh reported hull breaches on 17 decks as enemy fire found its mark. The Defiance was dying slowly, its experimental systems pushed beyond all safe limits. Life support was failing, and the engines were running on backup power. But Katie had one final modification that she had been saving for exactly this moment. Jake faced the most important decision of his life. The logical choice was to retreat and live to fight another day. But logic had never been humanity's greatest strength. He looked at his crew and saw the same insane determination that had brought them this far. They had proven that humans could fight the galaxy's deadliest enemy. Now they had a chance to do something that would echo through history. He gave the order that defined humanity's place among the stars. Instead of retreating, Jake commanded his crew to broadcast their position to every remaining Devourer ship in the system. They would invite the entire enemy fleet to attack them at once. It was the most illogical military decision ever made, and it was perfectly human. Danny Price flooded all communication frequencies with everything human civilization had ever created. Music from every era of Earth's history mixed with poetry, literature, and art. He broadcast children's lullabies next to military marching songs. He transmitted mathematical equations derived from Shakespeare's sonnets and tactical data based on ancient human board games. The effect on the Devourer fleet was immediate and devastating. Every enemy ship tried to analyze the flood of human culture at the same time. They were looking for patterns in nursery rhymes and strategic meaning in abstract art. Their adaptive systems, designed to learn from logical military data, began to overload as they tried to process the beautiful chaos of human creativity. Katie Walsh revealed her final secret as the Defiance flew straight toward the Prime Devourer. She had turned the entire ship into a kinetic weapon, using principles that alien engineers would never consider. Instead of building stronger armor or more powerful weapons, she had focused on making the ship incredibly fast and nearly indestructible through flexibility. Rather than strength, the Defiance accelerated toward the enemy command ship at a significant fraction of light speed. Jake felt the crew pressed into their seats as forces that should have killed them were absorbed by Katie's creative engineering. The ship bent and twisted under impossible stress but held together through human stubbornness and innovative design. Ben Hughes coordinated the final attack using every piece of human military history he could remember. The Defiance weaved through enemy fire like a fighter pilot from ancient Earth, following attack patterns derived from battles fought with swords and gunpowder. The ship's weapons fired in rhythms based on human heartbeats and musical compositions that had moved people to tears for centuries. The Prime Devourer tried to match human unpredictability, but found itself trapped by its own perfection. It could copy human tactics, but it could not understand the emotions that drove them. It could analyze human culture, but it could not feel the passion that created it. The enemy intelligence was fighting an entire species worth of creativity with nothing but cold logic. The final moment arrived as the Defiance struck the Prime Devourer's hull like a guided missile filled with human determination. The impact did not just destroy the enemy flagship, it created a cascade failure that spread through the Devourer communication network like a virus made of pure chaos. Jake felt the ship's hull crack around him as they punched through layers of alien armor. The Defiance was dying, but it was taking the enemy's greatest weapon with it. The Prime Devourer's death screams echoed across every frequency as its vast intelligence collapsed under the weight of trying to understand human irrationality. The destruction of the command ship sent shockwaves through the remaining Devourer fleet, cut off from their central intelligence and overwhelmed by the flood of human cultural data. The enemy ships began to shut down one by one. Their adaptive systems crashed like computers infected with a virus that turned logic into madness. Admiral Carter's voice reached the dying bridge of the Defiance through emergency communication channels. The battle was won. The surviving Devourer ships were vulnerable to conventional attack now that their hive intelligence was destroyed. Human vessels and alien survivors were already moving in to finish what the Defiance had started. Jake Morrison died knowing that humanity had saved the galaxy not through superior technology or military might, but through the chaotic creativity that made them human. His last thought was that the aliens had been wrong about human primitiveness. Chaos was not a weakness. It was the most powerful weapon in the universe when wielded by beings crazy enough to use it. The Battle of the Kepler Nebula became legend throughout the galaxy. The three ancient powers, humbled by their defeat and saved by human sacrifice, offered humanity leadership of a new galactic federation. They had learned that order without chaos was fragile, and that the universe needed beings who could think beyond the boundaries of logic. The Defiance was rebuilt as a monument to human courage and creativity. But more importantly, the ship's sacrifice had taught the galaxy a new way to face the unknown. Human unpredictability became the standard for exploring dangerous space and confronting threats that conventional wisdom could not handle. New ships were built using human design principles that emphasized flexibility over strength and creativity over efficiency. Alien crews learned to incorporate human chaos into their tactical planning. The galaxy discovered that the best defense against the unknown was not perfect preparation, but the ability to adapt and improvise when plans failed. Years later, when new threats emerged from the dark spaces between galaxies, they found a universe prepared for anything. The combined forces of order and chaos, alien logic and human creativity proved unbeatable. The galaxy had learned that survival required not just the wisdom of ages but the fresh perspective of beings willing to try something that had never been done before. Captain Jake Morrison and the crew of the Defiance had given the galaxy the greatest gift possible. They had shown that being human was not a weakness to be overcome, but a strength to be celebrated. In a universe full of ancient civilizations that had forgotten how to change, humanity brought the power of endless possibility. The stars belonged to all thinking beings now, but they sparkled a little brighter because humans were among them, ready to face whatever came next with courage, creativity, and the beautiful madness that made them unique in all the galaxy.